Hello, this is Dr. Mike Brooks. I'm a licensed psychologist and the director of the Austin Psychology and Assessment Center, or ApaCenter. Today's topic is part 5 on the series, Does Video Game Violence Cause Children and Adolescents to Become More Violent? And on this one, we're going to focus on the findings and limitations of the video game violence research that's already been done and out there. And there's not a ton of it. It's really in more recent years that they've gathered more data, and then also it's a moving target because video games keep evolving. You know, if you've played and watched, they're very different from what they were like in the 80s, as you saw in the last segment on the evolution of video games. So I've got my iPad here, so I'm going to be going point by point, and this is best I can do at summarizing this body of research. And I did, again, my dissertation on the effects of video game violence on kids and have kept abreast of the research. There's always new stuff coming out, so I'll qualify some things based on that, but here's what I got for you. So first point is, and you'll just see the on the video, just the points come up, and I'm going to be reading from the iPad. So the first thing is there's a correlation between violent video games and aggression. So that means people who play violent video games seem to be more aggressive in general. And a second point, that there seems to be increases in physiological arousal, aggression-related thoughts and emotions, and sometimes behavior. The behavior is harder to measure. So a lot of times if they do studies with college students, for instance, like how they exactly measure aggressive behavior is tricky because, you know, the undergrads tend not to just punch each other after playing a violent video game. In thoughts and emotions, it's easier to measure those, and there's a better body of research on supporting that those are increased by violent video game play. Next point, some areas of the brain that are activated are associated with aggressive thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. We've done some brain scans and noticed that. Subsequent to violent video game play, there appears to be a decrease in helping behavior. The next one, in the short term, younger children seem to be more affected by the violence than older players. This may not be that surprising, and the young kids are more affected by what they watch, more influenced by what they watch and experience than adults. Next point, there's some mixed findings on the relationship between violent video game play and long-term increases in aggression. So this is still to be fleshed out, and I saw one recent study that made a connection, but some in the past had not. And this actually begs the question of some of the limitations of the research, so I'm going to go on to that next. There are many limitations. One is demand characteristics, and this is a term that's well known in psychology and research studies to affect the outcome, and that is when participants know what's being studied, what researchers are looking for, they unconsciously tend to provide the answers or provide the types of responses that the researchers are looking for. For instance, with video game violence, if the undergrads, for instance, figure out that the researchers are trying to look for aggression-related thoughts and feelings subsequent to violent video game play, so they've played a violent video game, now they get some type of questionnaire about their thoughts or feelings. If they figure out that that's what researchers are looking for, then unconsciously they'll tend to provide that type of response. Biased researchers. Researchers are not immune to bias. There's a thing in psychology called a confirmation bias, so that we sort of see what we want to see. Studies can be designed to show about anything one wants to show. And some researchers who've studied video game violence for a number of years, and even there's a couple researchers that have been looking at it for decades now. It might be very difficult, as objective as they're trying to be, to do a study and let's say they get results that conflict with their previous years of research showing there is a connection between violent video game play and aggression, and then they do a study that finds there's not one. It's very difficult to then contradict many years of research findings. So there can be a bias there. And then a publication bias in that in social sciences, when there is a finding, like you find there is that violent video game play does increase aggression, that type of finding is much more likely to get published than one that says, oh, nope, no difference. So then the ones that have this positive finding end up getting published and end up getting cited. They end up getting seen by the media and in the newspapers, and the ones that don't find the finding are just, they fall by the wayside and no one knows about them. And in two recent meta-analytic reviews of TV and video game violence research, and that's where it's a study of studies where they look at all the different studies. Statistically, this researcher controlled for the effect of publication bias, and what he found was that, and this was Ferguson, did this, and he found that the relationship between violent video game play and aggression dropped out once publication bias was controlled for statistically. And it can't be denied that most children who watch television violence and play violent video games play without apparent negative effects, not significant enough to point the finger at them. And this is another big point, is that on research on aggression, what they find is it's generally a learned behavior, so that even with animal studies like rats that are bred to be aggressive, they tend to only aggress in particular circumstances, like their territories being infringed upon, and then they'll act very aggressively. So it tends to be learned and situationally dependent, and when it's learned, it tends to be learned when we're younger, so that prior to age 8, aggression can be learned. And then it becomes trait-like instability. So the very young aggressive child is likely to be an aggressive tween, and then a teenager, and then an adult. Importantly, the most violent games that are like Call of Duty and Halo and the fighting games, Mortal Kombat, some of the ones that you saw in the other video, those are M-rated and for 17 and up. So unless parents aren't supervising their kids, the younger kids that are playing Mario type games and things like that, or Minecraft, that aren't really very violent, or it's very cartoonish and very unrealistic, those kids aren't playing those really violent games, or shouldn't be playing. Another point is there are many methodological flaws in current studies. For instance, when they're looking at short-term effects of violent video game play on aggression-related thoughts, emotions, and behavior, many of these studies do not control for frustration. And there's a vast body of research that shows there's a relationship between frustration and aggression. And importantly, a game does not have to be violent for it to be frustrating and lead to aggression-related thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. For instance, golfers could miss an important putt and be, breaking their golf clubs in half or throwing them in the lake. And probably from your own experience, whether it's bowling or pool or, it could even be checkers or something. where you get very frustrated at it, and then you're more likely to feel aggressive and even act in an aggressive manner. And many video game violence studies do not control for frustration. Another big one is correlation doesn't equal causation. So just because, for instance, there's a relationship found between video game violence and aggressive behavior, it doesn't mean the violent video game play caused the aggressive behavior. There's also a big finding that aggressive kids and adults are more likely to be drawn to violent forms of media. So it's kind of that chicken and egg question. Then you have another limitation is, what about Japan and other countries? There's many countries that societally have much lower levels of violence than the United States, yet they consume violent video games and violent media at rates similar to or more than the United States. So then we have to explain, well, what's going on there? If it has such a big effect, why doesn't it have an effect on other countries and their populations as much as it does the US? So that brings us to the next important point, is if we look at the statistics on violent crime in the United States, they've actually gone down quite a bit, even for teens in the last 30 or 40 years. So in the next segment, we're going to take a look at that because that's something a lot of people don't know. Sometimes by watching TV and all the horror stories, it looks like we're going to hell in a handbasket, but actually that's not true. And we're going to look at that at the next segment. So again, this is Dr. Mike Brooks, licensed psychologist and the director of the Austin Psychology and Assessment Center, or ApaCenter. Thanks so much for joining me today, and I look forward to seeing you at our next segment.